Over the last few years, I have found myself developing a deep love for stories set within post-apocalyptic worlds, and I've noticed others online sharing the same passion. There's just something about dark worlds torn apart from one reason or another that draws out human desperation, struggle, and hope like no other. And as weird as it sounds, I've kind of found them comforting. There's a strange peace in being able to watch or play as characters living through worlds as messed up as they are, yet striving to survive and even thrive all the same. Games like Dark Souls, Elden Ring, and Death Stranding are ones that started to draw me into generally darker worlds, with Death Stranding being one of the first stories that really sold me on the post-apocalyptic setting, through its story of a fractured world trying to save itself from extinction. My love of this genre is why Cyberpunk 2077, while not post-apocalyptic, holds a special place in my heart, as its DNA is often post-apocalyptic in nature, presenting the player with a heartless world and asking them to look for the light when seemingly overcome by darkness. It is no surprise then that when The Last of Us adaptation was announced, I was immediately intrigued, as I'd never played the game before, shout out Xbox users, but it was one I'd always heard great things about. So after seeing the first trailer for the HBO adaptation and realizing that these characters, the horror, and the story were something that seemed to tick all my post-apocalyptic boxes, I decided to give it a shot. Part of my motivation also lay in the fact that the PC port would be released soon after the show, and trying out the show to see if it was something I would really be interested in was less expensive than a $70 game. I had very little knowledge of the story, characters, and world as a whole, like I didn't even know about LA's condition, but boy did I have no idea what I was getting myself into. It only took about 10 minutes or so into the first episode, and I was hooked. I was absolutely enthralled, and became even more so with each subsequent episode as they released, as I fell deep into unraveling both the world and the relationship of these two people trying to make it, together, in a world as broken as they were, while doing their best to protect each other in a loving, strained bond that is constantly being put to the test. Once the show finished, I finally understood why the story was so special to so many, and so much so that after months of this story constantly living rent-free in my head, I decided to check out the source material to try and re-experience it. So once the PC port was smoothed out, it just needed a little bit of work, I booted up Steam to jump back into this world I had fallen in love with, ready and excited to experience it and its story and all the emotional moments once more. But not 30 minutes in, I kind of found myself oddly disappointed. I was confused. I was like, why was I feeling this way when I know I love everything about these characters and the story and the world? I didn't quite understand why the show had made such a strong impact on me, whereas the game, the original source material, wasn't hitting as hard. Was it because I'd already experienced the story, so playing it wasn't as new? Was it because the gameplay wasn't the greatest? Or was it something else? As I kept playing, I started to realize that while it was partially due to all of those issues, yes, it was mainly because while I loved the game, I found the adaptation to be a much deeper experience on almost every level. And before everyone freaks out in the comments, just let me explain. You see, while I have adored being able to walk in the ravaged streets and gorgeous scenery of the game world, the show was just able to do so much more in expanding character relationships, the story, and even world building than the game ever could. If I had played the game first, I certainly would have loved it, but I think that I would have still preferred the show experience. It really honors the source material so well, while fleshing out and expanding on practically every aspect of the story, and cutting out some of the weakest parts in my opinion, which is the gameplay, all while somehow capturing the feel of this world in an even greater way than the game. So I want to talk about a couple reasons why that is, and for me, one of the biggest improvements was in the character nuances. One of the initial draws of the TV show for me was its characters and actors. I was incredibly intrigued to see how live actors would interpret and make these characters their own while trying to stay true to the source material. Which, yeah, sounds like an impossible task, and one that some diehard fans would say they failed at. But if you can honestly look at any scene in this show and still say the actors didn't kill it, then I think you're lying to yourself.
I'm failing in my sleep. That's all I do. That's all I've ever done. It's failure.
And just to clarify before everyone clicks off the video, I very much love and appreciate the original performances. While I personally preferred Pedro Pascal's physical performance as Joel, I also preferred Troy Baker's voice for the character. And the same goes for Bella Ramsey and Ashley Johnson. I mean, Ashley Johnson in particular is so iconic as Ellie at this point, and it's clear why.
So is that everything you hoped for?
Jury's still out. But man, can't deny that view.
In a perfect world, I would combine the voice work from the game with the physicalities of the show actors, but instead, we were able to have these two equally amazing and distinct interpretations. Now, the show's actors obviously don't play the characters one-to-one, but I'd argue that that wasn't exactly the point. The directors and actors clearly made sure that the essence of these characters and stories remained intact, while giving Pedro Pascal, Bella Ramsey, and the rest of the cast a chance to have their unique spins on the same characters that we love. And it certainly helped that Neil Druckmann, the creator and writer of The Last of Us, was heavily involved here. Another recent example of this is the Star Wars Ahsoka show. She is a character that has been exclusively in animation up until recently and brought into live action by a different actor. It is done with so much care. While Rosario Dawson isn't playing the same Ahsoka from the Clone Wars, as she's now older, wiser, and battle-hardened, she is still keeping the same essence of the character I love while putting some of herself into the role. In this instance, we also see that the character's creator is heavily involved in the creative process, which is a huge factor in successful adaptations because we've seen what happens otherwise. Halo, The Witcher. I say all of this because in these performances, one of the first things I noticed differed between the game and the show was the character relationships and dynamics, as I found the show to provide a deeper experience to nearly every character relationship, starting with Joel and Sarah. I knew going into the game that the time with these two would be different than the show, as I'd seen some interviews with Neil Druckmann saying how they were able to focus more on Sarah in the first episode than in the game, but I didn't realize just how much more until actually playing. Not only was I surprised to find out how little time we get with Sarah, but I was more surprised with how much less I felt towards her and Joel's relationship. The show gives us quite a few extra scenes with the two of them, like the breakfast scene and an expanded scene of the watch giving, and as well as greater context behind it. Whereas in the game, Sarah tells us that she borrowed money for the watch. In the show, we not only get to see that, but we get to additionally see the beginnings of the outbreak. While this is a separate point I'll be talking about later, the extra time that we spend with Sarah here not only serves to flesh out her character, but also builds tension in the viewers about whatever is going on. Instead of solely keeping Sarah at the house and having that moment of tension and fear be when Joel is gone and the outside world sounds chaotic, we actually get to see and feel the town's reaction, adding to a bit of the world building. Because as Sarah goes about her day, we see the fear in the watch shop owners, the townsfolk, and her neighbors begin to escalate as the day goes on, kind of eerily reminiscent of what we all felt during the first few days of COVID. And we get all of this from her point of view, making her inevitable death that much more impactful. And this was actually one of the few plot points I did know about, and knowing her death was coming, despite all the time spent with her, added such a layer of tension and sadness when she dies in Joel's arms, along with a part of himself. Having the show expand so much more on this relationship and Joel's identity as a father personally made his relationship with Ellie and their dynamic even more enjoyable to watch, as they both go from not wanting anything to do with each other to reluctantly realizing that they need and love each other, something Joel desperately tries to ignore. In terms of their relationship as a whole, though, I think there's really not that much of a difference between the game and the show and their dynamic, apart from that added depth of Sarah's impact, as well as experiencing Ellie's backstory in the course of the main story rather than after. But there are a lot of additional moments sprinkled throughout the show that serve to build their bond, like this one.
Did you know diarrhea is hereditary?
What?
Yeah. It runs in your genes.
That is so goddamn stupid.
You laughed, motherfucker.
I didn't laugh.
Yes, you did.
Jesus, I'm losing it.
You're losing it big time.
Go to sleep.
I also loved how much of their dialogue and scenes are just directly pulled from the game, as it's pretty much perfect there, and the show simply added more layers to that already complex nature of their relationship. And speaking of added layers, I want to briefly talk about how the show really expanded the two other important relationships in Joel's life, Tommy and Tess. Playing the game second, I was very surprised at how little character development both of these had in the game versus the show, and when playing, Tess in particular was just not as big of a presence at all, it felt like. It's more subtly hinted at in the game that she and Joel have a past together, but the show makes it more clear that they are both, and Joel specifically, deeply caring for each other. In the game, I got the sense that Joel cared, sure, but even when she sacrificed herself, he didn't seem all that attached. Like, obviously he was, but the show just made it a more emotional performance, in my opinion. Tommy is pretty much in the game and the show an equal amount, but what I liked about the adaptation more was how they altered Tommy's role a bit. Instead of just being out west somewhere, the script is tweaked so that he's actually been assumed missing for a while, and Joel has been wanting to go after him, giving him and the audience a little extra investment in transporting Ellie. It's really just a minor thing in the grand scheme of the story, but I found this added motivation just an additional reason for me to get hooked. Another prominent difference I found experiencing the story through the show first was the additional world building and character stories it offers, and most importantly for me, less combat. So starting out with the world building here, the brand new cold open created for the show was just pure brilliance from both a story and cinematic perspective. I absolutely loved everything here, from the technical side with the sound design and editing setting the mood from being lighthearted to terrifying and back again. It was amazing. It was such a perfect setup in how simple yet horrifying the idea of a cordyceps outbreak could be, and that humanity would be rendered so.
Cordyceps, aspergillus, any one of them could become capable of burrowing into our brains and taking control not of millions of us, but billions of us. Billions of puppets with poisoned minds, permanently fixed on one unifying goal: to spread the infection to every last human alive by any means necessary. And there are no treatments for this, no preventatives, no cures. They don't exist. It's not even possible to make them.
So if that happens,
we lose.
We'll be back.
And since I knew very little of the story, it got me immediately intrigued and kept me watching. While I don't necessarily think that the game needed this back in the day, it's still certainly another great example of how the show was able to expand the source material, something I saw a lot more in both episodes 3 and 7. If you're familiar with both the story and the show, you'll know that these episodes both serve as primarily flashback episodes that flesh out what's happening in the main plot, albeit episode 7, which focuses on Ellie's past, does that more. Before we get to that though, I can't skip over episode 3, which is the now famous Bill and Frank episode, which just from a technical standpoint is a masterpiece in its small storytelling of those two individuals and how they tried to make the best out of a broken world. While none of this was inherently in the game, their relationship is hinted at, and it was another aspect that Druckmann got to really flesh out more here. Now, this episode did ruffle some feathers as it slightly changed the game plot, but honestly, I didn't see why. In the game, Joel and Ellie meet up with Bill to get a car so that they can go west faster, and the show still ends up with that same outcome, just without Bill being alive to help. I liked the inclusion of this episode as it gave us a different perspective on the outbreak and showed us that other people were attempting to, and in some ways were successful in, living as normal of a life as possible. Something that we, the viewers, all want for Joel and Ellie, but as the show progresses, seems like it may not be the case. Now, real quick, before I touch on episode 7 and my experience with it in the show and its importance, I want to briefly talk about something episode 3, and really the show as a whole, has that is vastly different from the game, and that is the combat. And what I mean by combat here is specifically encounters with infected, the clickers, etc., not humans. Because playing the game after the show, I really did not enjoy these combat encounters, because man, the game just throws them at you constantly. And while yes, it's meant to make the world feel dangerous and heighten the tension and just, provide gameplay for the players, I find that by the time I arrived at Bill's, I was more scared of the outdated shooting controls killing me than any of the infected. In comparison, the show really cuts down the amount of infected encounters to just the perfect amount to keep fear alive in the viewer. Every scene has that same tension that I felt the first few times you encounter infected in the game, and because of that, I truly felt as if the characters were in danger. I mean, that first encounter with the clickers, man, oh gosh, insanely intense in the game for sure, but the shot work and sound design in the show just amped up the tension for me even more in every scene that they were in, including in episode 7, which is arguably one of the most important episodes in the entire show. The inclusion of Ellie's backstory in this episode was something I really appreciated, as it wasn't actually in the main game, but rather introduced later as a DLC, so they didn't even necessarily have to include it here. But from what I've heard, this is a very faithful rendition of that story. I don't know personally because I haven't gotten to that point in the game yet. But that's great to hear because I really love this episode. It comes at a point in the story where Joel is injured and Ellie is nearly losing it at the thought of someone else leaving her, and then we get to actually see why she's so afraid of that and who else she has lost. It's this fear of losing another loved one that drives both Ellie and Joel in their own ways, and is ultimately what drives the whole plot of Part 1 and Part 2, I'm told. I haven't played yet. This central fear is what causes Ellie to make Joel take her to the Fireflies rather than Tommy, which then leads Joel to making the choice to save her instead of possibly creating a cure. Now, I'm not going to debate if he was right or wrong in his choice because that's been done many times over the last 10 years, but I bring this up now because it is this fear and love that I think is crucial to the story of The Last of Us, and is crucial as to why I personally love the adaptation more. More often than not, fear is found at the heart of any good post-apocalyptic story, because any post-apocalyptic story worth its while is a story about people above all else, and fear is always a struggle at the heart of humanity. But fear is only effective in storytelling when it's pitted against an equally contending force, be that a physical one or an emotional one. Fear of death, fear of the unknown, and the fear of losing a loved one are some of the greatest inciting incidents to some of the greatest stories of all time, where a protagonist struggles to put aside that fear and go on their adventure anyways. The Last of Us is no exception to this, and because of that, it is perhaps one of the greatest examples of this storytelling in action, both in its original form and the adaptation. But for me, the show really does a far better job of conveying this theme. Through the small added character nuances and greater world building and foreshadowing, it represents the themes of love, loss, and what lengths fear can cause a person to go to in a more compelling and engaging way. Not in spite of the source material, but because of it, as the show simply builds on an already phenomenal story. It is this story with its flawed, human characters and harsh, comforting world that has stuck with me long after experiencing it, and I have no doubt it will continue to long into the future. If you somehow stumbled onto this video without having experienced the story in either of its forms, I strongly encourage you to do yourself a favor and watch The Last of Us. Thank you for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day, and don't forget to always look for the light in the darkness.